Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari A to Z Flashback, a series of short playthroughs of the 150 games that make up the Atari Flashback Classics collection for Nintendo Switch. Don't forget you can play all these games on Xbox One and PlayStation 4 as well, because there's 3 separate volumes of Atari Flashback Classics available for those platforms as well, if you don't want to go the emulation route. There is also, of course, the emulation route as well, but you didn't hear that from me, obviously. Anyway, today's game is Destroyer. Destroyer is an arcade game that came out in 1977, so it's from Atari's early black and white era. However, it's one of the games that hid that fact quite well by having coloured screen overlays. And it was also designed to be a very tactile, very exciting experience for its players. Rather than having just a conventional joystick and buttons, what we had in this game is we had a rotary dial control for controlling the depth of your depth charges. That'll do. And also there was a lever control to determine your ship's speed. Now obviously the Nintendo Switch only has certain controls available to it, so a certain part of the experience is lost when playing the home ports of it, or this home port anyway. There's one interesting thing about Destroyer is it didn't really get a home port of its own. Instead, what happened is that the Atari 2600 version of Canyon Bomber, so you remember Canyon Bomber from a few weeks ago, the Atari 2600 version of that, which was ported by one David Crane, who 2600 enthusiasts will probably be well familiar with, that included a mode called Sea Bomber, which wasn't completely identical to Destroyer, but it was pretty damn close. So when we come to look at Canyon Bomber on the 2600 in a few weeks' time, you'll see that at work. For now though, let's take a look at Destroyer. Alright, here we are with Destroyer, which is another one of Atari's early black and white games. Although in this case, obviously we have it disguised quite nicely by this lovely artwork overlay. Obviously this does have quite a lot in common with Canyon Bomber, which we've already seen on this series, and it's a very simple idea. But in executing that simple idea, it manages to be really quite an addictive and pleasing game. I like a lot. So the way it works basically is you have this line which you can move up and down. And in the original game that would have been controlled by a dial controller, a bit like a paddle. And so on the Switch version you make use of the analog stick. And again, like the other implementations of paddle controls in the Atari Flashback Classics collection, it's a good idea to sort of, rather than just try and push up and down, which will send you to the extremes, it's a good idea to, if you go around the perimeter of the analog stick in a sort of semicircular motion, you'll find you have a bit more precise control over what's happening. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but yeah, it's something you can master without too much difficulty. Yeah, unlike Canyon Bomber, it doesn't count misses in this. It's time limited rather than based on whether or not you hit your target. So basically you've got to hit as many targets as you can within the time limit. And you'll notice, interestingly, that you don't actually have to hit the targets head on either. You don't actually have to score a direct hit on them. All you have to do is make sure that the explosion your death charge triggers is vaguely near the target. What you do have to consider though is the depth at which you are dropping that depth charge, because the depth charge will only explode when it reaches the point that the line was at when you released it. So if you put, you can't just keep your line down at the bottom of the screen and just drop depth charges randomly, because they just won't go off, they won't hit anything. But you see there that the explosion was actually ahead of the submarine I was trying to defeat, and it still got rid of it. So again, a couple of other interesting differences from Canyon Bomber. You can drop several depth charges at once in this. I think it's 3 at a time you can manage before you have to wait to reload. And you've also got a speed control as well. So in the original arcade game you had a speed lever, a bit like a sort of throttle control, that you could switch your ship between high and low speed. On the Switch version here you can just use the trigger buttons to switch between the 2 different speeds available to you. And those are the only controls you've got, really. That's all you need. And that's enough to make quite an enjoyable, entertaining game. I don't like this quite as much as I like Canyon Bomber, just because the sort of additional degree of accuracy required in this one. So adding that additional mechanic, I think it sort of dilutes the really nice simplicity that Canyon Bomber's got going on, but it's still fun, and I think it works really well. Oh, you can drop 4 at once. There we go. I stand corrected. But yeah, it's still an enjoyable game. It's still a good example of a game that doesn't need to do anything especially complicated, and it provides that addictive factor just through sort of encouraging you to keep trying to get better, to improve your score. And there's also the tantalizing prospect of being able to extend your time limit as well. If you can score, I think it's 2,500 points under the default settings, you can actually get an extension on your time limit. Yeah, there we go. Extended play for 2,500. I've not got anywhere near that so far, but it is something you can take aim for. And it's if you're really going for high scores, if you really want to dominate the leaderboards on this, then it's a milestone to aim for, certainly. And so mastery of this game is just getting a feel for timing, basically. So timing for dropping your depth charges and combining that with how long it takes to reach various points on the screen, where you need to put your line, and when to make use of the different speeds. So I still find myself just using the slow speed most of the time because I find it a little bit easier to aim. But in order to actually catch up with some of those subs, you're going to need to adjust your speed a little bit, particularly if you've got like a fast-moving one going in the same direction as you. Like there, for example, that's very difficult to time that, especially if it's deeper in the water. That was a nice hit. There we go. And you'll notice that the score increases the further down the screen things are. So the deep subs, which are harder to hit, you get more points for. Which makes sense. And you don't seem to get any different points for the fast-moving subs, I don't think. So it is literally just entirely based on depth. So in many ways, you're best off sort of almost prioritising the larger, easier-to-hit, slower subs. Simply because they're more likely to be a reliable source of points. But there's no penalty for sort of firing off lots of shots or anything like that, so you can fire off salvos of... See, there's a good example of where the speed control is useful, just to get ahead of that one that was going at the same speed as me and be able to hit it in the process. Now, as we'll see when we come to look at the Atari 2600 port of Canyon Bomber, this didn't get its own home port as such, but it did get a mode in Canyon Bomber that was pretty much exactly this game. So you weren't controlling a ship in that one, you were still flying planes and helicopters and various aircraft, but the actual execution was exactly the same. So you were controlling a line with a paddle controller, you were firing off bombs and attempting to use the appropriate timing to get rid of them. So I thought that was quite interesting. It's one of many things that gave the home port of Canyon Bomber considerably more value than a lot of other arcade ports at the time, because it wasn't just trying to be a straight arcade port, because, I mean, as we've seen, as good as Canyon Bomber is, it doesn't have a lot of substance to it. So if you expect people to pay however much 2600 games would have been when they were first released, then you need to make sure that there's some lasting value for them there. Different publishers, of course, manage this. Different developers, I should say, because these are all Atari games, manage this to varying degrees. There are some 2600 games that I wouldn't call them lazy ports, because I don't like describing the hard work that programmers do as lazy at any point. But yeah, there are certain games that there could have perhaps been a bit more added to provide better value for the home players. But Canyon Bomber wasn't one of them. Canyon Bomber was an early example of a game by David Crane, who would go on to be a very well-known name in Atari 2600 history. So he ended up working for Activision for a lot of games, and you may know him as the man behind games like Pitfall. But his work on Canyon Bomber was one of his earlier works while he was doing stuff for Atari. And yeah, he set a really good example there by providing a home port that was distinct from the arcade original but still recognisable. And so there was still some value to the arcade original. You could still go to the arcades and have a unique experience, but his home port was such that it provided a comparable experience to the arcade in terms of gameplay, and then some more as well. So, which is what you want if you're paying considerably more than you'd be paying for a single play on an arcade machine. So compare sticking 10p in an arcade machine to paying, I don't know, 30 quid or however much a 2600 game would have cost at the time. Okay, anyway, so that is pretty much everything there is to see in Destroyer. That is literally all the game is. But again, like Canyon Bomber, sometimes the simplest game concepts are some of the most effective. And like I say, while I don't like this quite as much as I like Canyon Bomber, I do think it's an enjoyable, good game. And it's nice to see some of these slightly lesser known Atari arcade games on this collection. So again, this is one of those games that I wasn't familiar with prior to this Nintendo Switch release of Atari Flashback Classics. So it's always nice to get a feel for games that you maybe haven't come across before. So that's Destroyer. Check it out. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please help out the channel by leaving a like or a comment and subscribing. New episodes of Atari A to Z are on Tuesdays and Atari ST A to Z on Thursdays. Check out atariatoz.wordpress.com for a full archive. Do please also check out my other projects moegamer.net, where I explore Japanese and Japanese-inspired games from yesterday and today, and videopackgames.wordpress.com, which aims to catalogue a small but well-formed library of the Philips G7000 Videopack computer, also known as the Magnavox Odyssey 2. You can also support my work on Patreon or buy me a coffee. You can find links to do both down in the video description. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.